Hello, SC Whitmore government students. Today's lesson is going to be on the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are our first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now, what an amendment is, it's a change or an addition to a document. In this case, we're going to create 10 additions to the original document, in the beginning, all at the same time. And what these 10 amendments are going to have in them are a list of rights that we have as Americans. There were a lot of people who were concerned about creating a stronger federal government because they feared that that government would take away too many rights from the people, that it would infringe on our rights. Um, Madison, who's known as the father, James Madison, who was the fourth president, he's known as the father of the Constitution. He was concerned about creating a Bill of Rights because he said once you start listing rights, then the government could say those are your only rights and you don't have any others. Well, we're going to alleviate that concern. We're going to get rid of that concern with the Ninth Amendment, which we'll look at in a second. We're going to look at these 10 amendments. But the Bill of Rights was important because without the Bill of Rights, I don't know the Constitution would have gotten passed as well or ratified. And the Bill of Rights are also important because they do list specific fundamental rights that we have as Americans. Now, there are four different types of rights in the Bill of Rights. We have first are substantive rights. These are the fundamental rights that belong to all citizens. These are basic things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. These substantive rights really are part of our natural rights. If we go back to the Declaration of Independence, remember Jefferson wrote in the Declaration that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are our natural rights. He said they come from the Creator and that government's job is to protect those. Well, now in the Bill of Rights, we're actually going to list out what some of those specific substantive rights are. What does it mean to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? How do we actually quantify that? And so we're going to do that in the Bill of Rights. The second group of rights in the Bill of Rights are called procedural rights. These are rights that deal with the justice system and ensuring that the justice system cannot abuse the people, that your freedom can't just be taken away. You can't just be thrown in jail or have property taken from you just because the government wants to do that. These protect us. And so I want you to really think about the courts and the justice system, the police, when you think about procedural rights. And then we have what are called unenumerated rights. These are rights that aren't specifically listed in the Bill of Rights, but they're implied. An example of that would be the right to travel. Now, nowhere in the Bill of Rights are we going to find that people have the right to travel around America. And yet we know that we do have that right. That would be an unenumerated implied right. And so we are going to have those. And this is what Madison was concerned with. So the Ninth Amendment is actually going to say that we have other unenumerated rights. We have other rights than the ones listed. The last set of rights are called civil rights. These are ones that are going to be, we're really going to find these later, and we're actually going to have to create new amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment after the Civil War. These are rights that deal with equal treatment under the law based on race, ethnicity, gender, etc. And these are really going to come later. We're going to find that civil rights weren't really a thing early in our history. Later, after the Civil War, and really as a part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, we're going to focus on these civil rights and how the Constitution does guarantee us civil rights. It does guarantee equal treatment under the law. And just in case we think it didn't, we're going to add amendments to prove that it does. Okay, so we're going to go through these 10 amendments. We're not going to get as detailed as I would like. We're just going to sort of do an overview. There are future lessons that will deal with some of these amendments in more detail, but I do want to go through them and give an overview. Let's start with the First Amendment. It's very important. It also has a lot in it. So we're going to take a little bit of time on this one. There are 5 big rights in the First Amendment. The first is freedom of speech. You have the right to political speech. Now, the most protected of all speech in America is political speech. In other words, criticizing the government, speaking out on political issues, whether it's abortion or taxes or whatever, immigration, whatever it is, that's political speech. So you can find political speech offensive, but it's the most free type of speech. There are other types of speech that also we have that freedom, but they're not as absolute as political speech. In other words, other types of speech can be restricted. Just to give you an example, local governments can say that you can't just shout expletives, you can't just shout curse words on the street in the middle of the day. You could be fined for that. Some local governments do have those fines, others do not. And you can say, well, that's my freedom of speech. Well, that's not the most protected kind of speech. Political speech is the most protected kind. So other forms of speech can be limited at least a little bit. Freedom of religion, that's the second freedom in the First Amendment. There are two parts to freedom of religion. There's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause says that the government cannot establish an official religion in America. So they can't say, we're all going to be Lutherans, or we're all going to be Catholic, or we're all going to be Muslim. They can't do that in America. There is no establishment of religion in America. On the other hand, the other side of that is called the Free Exercise Clause. Not only can the government not establish a religion, the government can't stop you from exercising your religion. So your ability to go to whatever church or faith house that you'd like to go to, or to not practice a faith at all. That's part of freedom of religion in America. Freedom of the press. That's a third right in the First Amendment. Freedom of the press is the media. We're talking about news, whether that news is on in print, on newspapers, or internet. Today it would be internet, or whether that news is video, TV. That freedom of the press guarantees that our news media can really poke and prod at our government. They can try to get to the bottom of what the government is doing. There are some countries around the world that the government controls the media, so you never really know what that government is doing because they can just lie and tell the media they have to report one-sided things. In Russia, that's going on right now. The Russian people really don't have a full understanding of what's going on in their war with Ukraine because Putin, the leader there, he controls the media. That's not true in America. In America, we have freedom of the press. Now, there are people who rightly acknowledge we have two different kinds of presses, and they're both biased. You have media that tend to lean towards the liberal Democratic Party, and then you have a media that tend to lean towards the conservative Republican Party, and it's hard to get to the truth because these two media are so biased. Well, that's true, but they're free to do that. That's the point, is that the government can't tell them you cannot report the way you want to report, even if that reporting is false. The right to assemble is also a First Amendment right. In other words, you have the right to gather and protest. Then the last one is the right to petition the government. You have the right to get a group and to call your congressman or to email him or to get a list of names. That's called a petition, a list of names saying we want this to happen. You have the right to ask your government to change. You have the right to petition your government. Now, before we move any further, I want to be very clear. None of our constitutional rights are absolute. In other words, they can, in certain instances and situations, all of these rights are limited. We know that. It's just the amount that they're limited. That's where we get into disputes, and that's where we rely on the courts. We rely on the Supreme Court to rule. People bring lawsuits all the time saying, hey, my First Amendment was violated here, or my Second Amendment right was violated here. And then it's up to the courts, and ultimately sometimes the Supreme Court, to rule whether that's true or not. Oftentimes we see two things in conflict. We see freedom and we see safety at conflict with one another. And so in times of crisis, we'll often see rights, freedom limited in the name of safety. When things aren't so stressful, when things are not in crisis mode, we'll see freedom gain a little more power there. And what every generation has to do is decide, where is that balance between freedom and safety? Just to give you an example, after 9/11, airports really tightened down and they restricted a lot of our freedoms there. But we deemed it necessary to be safe. During the pandemic, we saw freedom and safety at conflict with one another. And ultimately, the people and the court, well, the courts are going to rule on it, but the people are the ones that have to demand how much they want of each. Do you want more freedom? Do you want more safety? And that's really going to be up for the individual and the generation to decide. I have my own opinions about it, and I'm sure you do as well. Okay, quickly we'll do the Second Amendment. There's not a lot to say about the Second Amendment because it's simply the right to own guns and weapons. Um, the Second Amendment actually says the right to bear arms. That's the phrase it uses, but that's what that means. It's the right to own guns and weapons. Again, we know this is not absolute. I can't take a weapon into an airport or into a school, but I do have the right to own weapons. The government has limited some of the weapons that I can own. I can't really have an active nuclear weapon in my house, nor would I want to, but so the government has limited those, but you have the right to own guns, basically, the right to protect yourself and to own weapons. Ultimately, the founders believed you had the right to own weapons in case you needed to protect yourself from the government, because you will remember that that's what they had to do with their own government of Great Britain. They had to protect themselves against that. The Third Amendment is one that's pretty obscure because it doesn't really come into play anymore, but it goes back to the Revolution. Right before the Revolution, the British had passed the Quartering Act, which forced Americans to house British soldiers, especially up in the Boston area. If soldiers, government officials, basically, soldiers or government officials, if they came knocking on your door, you had to give them room and board, a place to stay, and food to eat. The Third Amendment says you have the right to not do that. You have the right to not house anyone in your house that you don't want to, but specifically government officials. They can't come knocking on your door and demanding to stay at your house. The Fourth through Eighth Amendments, I put them all together. There's so much in these guys. I can't go over everything, but I'm going to give an overview. These are the procedural rights. These are our rights that deal with the criminal justice system. If you watch shows like Law and Order, these rights will be dealt with a lot in shows like that. The Fourth Amendment is the right to not have your property or yourself searched or property confiscated without a warrant or probable cause. In other words, they can't just come busting in your door and searching your house without having a warrant. And that warrant had to be, a judge had to sign off on that based on probable cause. In other words, they had to convince a judge that there was a good chance there was criminal activity in your house for them to go busting into your house, or even to come knock on your door and ask to come in. Or not ask. If they have a warrant, they can just come in. Now, they can knock on your door and ask, and you can say, nope, you have to go get a warrant to search my house or to search my person. Those are very important rights. Now, we talked about, like in airports, they can make you take off your shoes. Well, that's searching you. But we've deemed that airports are where the Fourth Amendment can be limited. In your house, though, it cannot. If they come busting in your house and they did not have probable cause, then anything they find in that house would be thrown out in a trial. They could have found the murder weapon. They could have found a body, and that would have been thrown out in courts because they would not have had probable cause. The Fifth Amendment is the right to a grand jury. In other words, this is, briefly explain this, they can't just charge you and indict you. It's called an indictment. They can't just charge you and bring you to trial without having sufficient evidence that you need to go to trial. They can't just say, you know what, we think he committed a crime, let's put him on trial. No, a grand jury will determine if there's actual evidence that you could have committed a crime. And then you go to trial. No double jeopardy. What that means is they can't try you for the same crime twice. If they charge you with something like stealing a candy bar from a store, and you go on trial and the jury finds you not guilty, then they can never try you for that exact crime again. Now, if you steal something else, they can try you for that, but they can't try you for that crime. You could even go out and say, you know, I did it, and this is how I did it, and they still couldn't try you for that again because you were found not guilty. That's what no double jeopardy means. And the reason for this, guys, is very simple. A government who really was out to get its political opponents could put someone on trial over and over and over and ruin their life, even if they didn't have evidence that they committed a crime. The right to not testify against yourself. This is the right to remain silent. Basically, they can't force me to get up on the stand and be a witness against myself. They can't force me when the police are asking me questions to answer those questions. Now, certainly you may look guilty if you don't, but they can't force you to do that. And in fact, any lawyer will tell their clients, don't say anything to the police because you could say something that they can then use in court against you. The right to due process. Due process is when you're given a fair trial. In other words, they can't just charge you with stuff. They can't just accuse you of things and then give you a trial that you didn't get a fair chance to defend yourself. No, you have the right to due process. We all have due process rights. And the reason our criminal justice system is often slow, it often makes us angry because it's so slow, is because everyone has the right to due process. Government compensation if it takes your property. Now, there's something called eminent domain, where the government could come in and say, we need to take this part of your property, this part of your yard, because we're going to build a highway that would benefit all citizens, and so we need this. If they do that, first of all, it would have to be ruled in court they can do it. If they do it, they have to compensate you, and usually it's giving you way more than the property is worth. Sixth Amendment. You have the right to a public trial without delay. A speedy trial is what that's called. Now, a lot of defendants, a lot of people accused of crimes will waive that right and will want a delay in the trial so that their lawyer can get evidence together for them. But you have the right to a public trial that is relatively speedy. They can't throw you in jail for 5 years and then decide to try you. Because what the government, if they did that, then they could have no evidence, know they're not going to win in court, throw you in jail, and then just keep you there for 5 or 6 years, and then decide, you know what, then we'll let him go because we didn't have the evidence to convict him. You have the right to a lawyer. In other words, you have the right to someone to defend you in court, someone who knows the law. So you have the right to a lawyer. You have the right to an impartial jury. In other words, you have the right to go into court and a jury not have already heard enough of the case that they've made up their minds. That's why it's so important with high-profile cases. They try to find people for the jury that just don't watch a lot of news or read a lot of news. So they want people as empty in their brain as they can get so that they can present the evidence to them, and then the people can decide based on the evidence, not based on what they've seen or heard in the public. You have the right to know your accusers and the evidence against you. The government, the prosecutor who represents the government, can't hold on to evidence and hide it from the defense. They have to tell the defense what the evidence is so that you can defend yourself, so that you can say, wait a minute, this piece of evidence I know is bogus, and here's why I know it's bogus. Or this person who's accusing me, I know that they're a liar and I can prove it. That's the right. You have the right to know those things. The Seventh Amendment is the right to a jury trial in civil cases. Now we know we have the right to a jury trial from the Sixth Amendment in criminal cases, cases where you could go to jail, but there are also cases where you could just be forced to pay money. Those are called civil cases. Those are lawsuits. So if somebody sues me because they were at my house and got injured, I have the right to a jury trial in order to determine whether they should get any money from me or not. In other words, I might not want a judge to rule in our case. I want a jury, a 12-person jury to rule whether I should have to pay that person or not. The Eighth Amendment is no cruel and unusual punishment. In other words, we can't decide we're going to punish people in a cruel way. This one, is a little controversial because some people say that states that have the death penalty, that is cruel punishment. Well, the founders would not have found that cruel, but today we might. And if we find that cruel, then under the Eighth Amendment, you can't have that. Okay, and the last two amendments are the Ninth and 10th Amendments. The Ninth Amendment is the one that Madison wanted to alleviate his concerns about other rights we may have. So what the Ninth Amendment says is that we have other rights than the ones listed in the first 8 amendments. Just because it's not listed doesn't mean you don't have that right. I used the right to travel earlier. That's an example. Another one is the right to some sort of privacy in your home. In other words, you want to keep private information private. You have that right. That's not listed in the Bill of Rights, and yet we know it's an unenumerated implied right. You have the right to privacy. The 10th Amendment says that powers not given to the federal government. So we listed all these rights, and we've listed all these powers earlier that the federal government has. If it's not listed as a federal government power, then that power belongs to the states or the people. And the 10th Amendment, why that's important is it establishes federalism in America. The idea that we have three levels of government. We've got the federal government, we got the state governments, and we got the local government. Our founders believed that the state and local governments were closer to the people and should have plenty of power. Yes, we had to have a federal government, but the fear was that that federal government would become too powerful. So how do we stop that from happening? One way we stop it from happening is by having lower levels of government, like state and local government. So what the 10th Amendment says is if it's not specifically given to the federal government, if power is not given to the federal government, then it belongs to the states. Education, the education system is an example of that. Each state gets to determine their own education system because of the 10th Amendment. It's not listed as a federal power, therefore it belongs to the states and the people. Now, these rights are very important for you to know. You need to know your rights. Every generation has to deal with how much power they're going to give up to have safety. But once you decide that, once you figure that out, you should absolutely fight to keep your rights. You should fight for your rights. And we need to ensure, our court system does this, of course, but we need to ensure that our people know their rights, because if people don't know their rights, they won't know when their rights are being abused. But if you know what your rights are, then you know if the government is taking it too far, and you can push back against that government. I hope you learned something today. If you have any questions about this lesson, feel free to let me know, and I'll see you next time.